In the last few hours, many people are not conscious. They slip into a sleep and then pass away. If I could offer some advice, I think the more you have a chance to see and experience the deaths of others firsthand, secondhand, I think the less anxiety we'll have when it's our turn.
Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily. The thought of dying can stir up a lot. Fear, avoidance, and that deep instinct from our cultural conditioning that death is the boogeyman, something to run from or to fight. My guest today has spent much of his medical career at the bedside of the dying, and he holds such a deep understanding of the body's incredible biological intelligence. That is just as awe-inspiring in its final weeks and days as it is at any other time of life. Plus, he empowers us to have conversations and to know our individual choices that we have at the end of life. Dr. David Casarett is a physician, researcher, tenured professor at the Duke University School of Medicine, TEDx speaker and author. He is the Chief of Palliative Care for Duke, where he directs the Duke Center for Palliative Care. And his brand new book, Undiscovered Country, A Doctor's Travel Guide to the End of Life, is just brilliant. I devoured it. And within this, David acknowledges that dying is mysterious for many of us, and that actually that brings up a lot of fear. But as David shares in my conversation today, as well as in his brilliant book, when we get a glimpse under the bonnet of what happens as we cross the threshold from life into death, we might just see that it's a process which isn't actually as scary as we thought. David, welcome to Death on the Daily.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I have been devouring your book. It's called Undiscovered Country, A Doctor's Travel Guide to the End of Life. And I'm really excited to dive in because for me, as I've read it, it really reads like a love letter to our body in its final journey, in something where culturally it's been conditioned into me that actually our body's failing. It feels very negative and very almost anti-natural. And there's such a beauty or reverence in how you describe the body's intricate processes. So I'd love to hear from you just a little bit around what happens biologically in our final days and hours.
Yeah, how much time do we have? It's fascinating. And I'm glad you said that because I think there's a tendency, particularly among healthcare providers like me, to see the course of a long illness or sometimes an unfortunately not so long illness that brings people to the end of life. And we sort of have a tendency, emotionally or cognitively to walk away, to assume that the body is done, it's failed, as you said. But there's a lot that goes on right at the end of life and even before that. And we don't have time for a 2-month seminar on physiology, but what's been remarkable to me is as I've gone through the journey of being a palliative care doctor for a couple of decades now, I won't get specific, but it's been a while, is that the body has some really interesting mechanisms that it uses to protect us. And I know that anthropomorphization is kind of a sin that, doctors and researchers are supposed to avoid, but it's hard not to see the way your body adapts and not think that there's some sort of grand plan. One of them that I see pretty much every time I take care of a patient who's dying is the loss of appetite. As we get closer and closer to the end of life, it's harder and harder to eat. We don't have energy. Our GI tracts are not working. And yet, at the same time, the sensation of hunger also diminishes. So as we get closer to the end of life and we can't take in nutrition, our bodies sort of recalibrate and damp down that desire for food. And there's a common misconception, I think, that when people stop eating near the end of life, they're hungry, they're starving. But we have mechanisms, ketones are a big one, molecules that are prompted by a lack of oral intake or nutrition. And those ketones have some physiologic functions, but they also have a really nice function of reducing appetite. And there are also molecules that bind to the receptors that are used in many current weight loss drugs conveniently that also reduce appetite. So at the time that we're less and less able to eat, our bodies are reducing our desire for hunger. And those two balance at a really elegant mechanism. So that's just one example that's really fascinated me over time.
Wow. I mean, that was one part of your book that was just really resonated with me. So actually, very recently, it was last month, both of my grandmothers died, 6 days apart, actually, quite incredibly, after over a decade each with dementia. And for both of them, that loss of appetite, and similarly with my granddad a couple of years ago, the loss of appetite has been the most distressing part of the journey for my family to witness. And I think this is where this knowledge is so essential, because if I look with my mum, my Sri Lankan grandmother, and she lived with my parents, and so for my mum, she was sleeves rolled up, hands-on care for her every single day. And that was the part where they would spend hours just arguing with my mum, saying, "You need to eat. Why aren't you eating?" And also, I think there's something in our relationships with other people, in the space that food holds for us culturally. And actually, it's something that we always do to care for people. So it can seem quite counter to say, actually, now they just don't want to eat, and that is totally okay. So for me personally, that's where these conversations are so essential, because actually there is such a lack of understanding of what just does completely naturally happen, and of the processes that happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. In dementia, we see this all the time, and
Mm.
families really have a tough time because,
Yes.
the person with dementia is essentially dependent on the family, both
Mhm.
to feed them and to advocate for artificial forms of nutrition, like a feeding tube, that goes directly into the stomach.
Mm.
And families feel like they're on the hook, that they have to advocate, which they do. I think we've all taken care of family members, and we know that people get better care if we advocate for them, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really hard for a family member to not feed somebody. As you say, it's such a
Mm.
basic need. It feels like not keeping somebody warm or dry or safe. It's one of these
Yes.
basic human needs. Like, how could you, and have this conversation all the time, like, well, mom's not eating, but we have to put a feeding tube in. Why? Because we can't let her starve. And
Yeah.
so we have long talks about this is how the body's telling us it's shutting down. She doesn't have any appetite now. That's her body's way of telling us that it's done,
Mm.
that we're nearing the end. But still, at a very visceral level, it's really hard to look at a loved one and say, I could feed you, but I'm not going to. So it's one of those
Mm.
questions that we can intellectualize as doctors all we want, but the emotional resonance, you can't get rid of that. But
Yeah.
it's I mean, we know in dementia, that feeding tubes don't really prolong life. And they set people up for all sorts of complications, like aspiration pneumonia, when the liquid nutrition that goes through the tube into the stomach comes back up and gets inhaled into the lungs, and that results in hospitalizations, bed sores. Sometimes people pull those tubes out, which is a surgical challenge. So lots of complications, not much benefit, and yet we put these feeding tubes in, I think, because at an emotional level, and providers, we're subject to that too. It's really hard to see somebody and not help them. So I'm sorry you went through that. It's not easy.
Oh, and I think that the conversation is so important. That's for me as well. The more that I have studied in this space and just understood, just through my work in the grief space, and I also took a training course in as an end of life doula, just to understand, like, what is the
Mm.
process, and so that more so I could use it for my family, because this is stuff that's just not as it used to be, passed down in generations, because we would witness it in our own home. But actually, I think the nuance of those conversations, and where, in my experience with my grandparents, palliative care, it's such a gentle and conversational process. And that's always struck me as a space that I wonder, for example, with my Amma, I think palliative care only came in like right at the end. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions as well around palliative care, when you should bring it in, the purpose of it. So as well, I'd love just to hear a little bit from you around that role for palliative care at the end of life. And actually, for anyone who's journeying with someone in their final stages, although as you share in your book, we just never know when that final breath will be. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you about palliative care, its role, and when we should seek it out to support us or someone we love in our journey.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a little bit odd, honestly, to be talking to somebody in the UK about palliative care, because palliative care came from the UK. Dame
Really?
Cicely Saunders is widely credited as the the grandmother, the great-grandmother, at St.
Wow.
Christopher's Hospice in London, and there's now a Cicely Saunders Institute, that Irene Higginson and Richard Harding, run, which is really sort of a beacon of palliative care around the world. They do a huge amount of
Mhm.
work, supporting palliative care in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. But yeah,
Wow.
so palliative care really started, with Dame Cicely Saunders and spread to the United States. Kathleen Foley is sort of our grandmother of palliative care,
Mhm.
and Balfour Mount, who just died about 2 weeks ago, was a cancer surgeon actually, who was the sort of the grandfather of palliative care in Canada. And then
Mhm.
it spread throughout the world. So maybe more history than you wanted to know, but yes, if you're in the
Wow.
UK, you're the home, the originators of palliative care.
Wow.
And it's interesting, palliative care and hospice were initially envisioned as kind of what you said, very end of life, sort of helping the death transition. Um, I think over the last 30 or 40 years, and really accelerating over the last 10 or so, palliative care has extended and really has tried to move upstream to see people much earlier than the last few days of life. People still enroll in hospice very near the end of life, but palliative care as a medical specialty tries to reach people as they're struggling with advanced serious illnesses, like cancer, but also heart failure and liver disease. And we here at Duke University, where I lead the palliative care program, we're not unique, but we've pushed pretty hard to try to get palliative care into clinics. So most of the people now we see in palliative care are not hospitalized, not near the end of life, but they're in clinic, and still seeking aggressive treatment. So
Wow.
struggling with cancer or heart failure, have difficult to manage symptoms, and our providers step in and help manage them. We take
Mm.
care of a lot of patients who are getting bone marrow transplants, are really hoping for 10, 20, 30 more years of life, but are
Yeah.
having bad symptoms. So that's, if there's a message to about palliative care, it's that we can do some of our best work, if you call us early. Um,
Right.
and not every health system has palliative care, not every geographic area does. But so finding it can be a challenge sometimes. But I think getting palliative care involved early, so you have a provider who can follow you along, with that journey, managing symptoms at first, then maybe later starting to talk about what's important to you, what your hopes and your fears are, and then toward the end thinking about what end of life care should look like for you. But that for us is the whole conversation. It's not just jumping in and talking about death and dying. We try ideally to do a lot before that.
Wow. I think those conversations are so important, and just thinking about that upstream journey, if I connect it into members of my family, that is so supportive. And even, I mean, I actually know St. Christopher's Hospice. I used to walk past it all of the time.
Mhm.
But also I know equally just how incredible the hospice system is as well, and all of those things, and just how essential they are. But actually, again, there's a journey that could be had before, I suppose, you get to that point where you're thinking, okay, now I'm going to be going into a hospice or whatever your choice is. I suppose if we fast forward to when someone is in their end stages of life, and it's clear, for example, for you as a doctor to see that. You've written in your book so powerfully how sometimes a doctor's desire to diagnose and to treat can, in some cases, do more harm than actually is good in that moment. And it's something that I've been really conscious of in our medical system, that there are things that is obviously brilliant and essential in going up to a hospital. But yeah, what does medicine get right and wrong about dying?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when I answer it, I'm always careful not to demonize
Mm.
medicine and doctors too much
Yes.
because I am one and I need to go to work every day with my colleagues. Um, and yeah, I need to earn a living, as a
Yeah.
doctor. But having said that, though, I would reframe it a little bit. I think you're asking exactly the right question. I've come to look at it a little bit differently, though, over the years. And it's less about what we get wrong and more about our timing. And by that, I mean, a lot of most people faced with a new diagnosis of cancer are going to want every possible treatment. Not everybody. And somebody with advanced dementia or somebody with multiple comorbidities, lots of other diseases going on, they might say, all right. But for the most part, everybody wants aggressive treatment. And so that's what medicine is designed to do, especially in the United States. We're
Mhm.
really good at treating, often over treating.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's one thing that medicine gets right. We assume that most people want treatment, and that's, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you've got big guns of chemotherapy, immunotherapy, radiation therapy, surgery, we see a
Amazing.
cancer, and for instance, and we try to treat it. So I think we get it right early on. I think where we get it wrong, sometimes with the same patient, is fast forward a month or 2 or 3 months later, 3 years, 5 years. At some point, people begin thinking, I just can't see going through another round of chemotherapy. Or I'm okay with chemotherapy, but if I get sick enough to go back into the hospital again, especially if I wind up in the intensive care unit, I really don't want to go through that again. And it's at that point, I think medicine starts to get it wrong, because we're still anchored on the conversation we had with somebody a month or a year ago where they said,
Mm.
yeah, everything. So it's not that we get it wrong, it's just that we stop getting it right,
Yes.
when patient preferences and goals change, and we don't stop to have those conversations again. And that's one thing that palliative care does, and we've actually been pretty aggressive at doing that at Duke, trying to encourage earlier and more often, more frequent conversations, so that as people are going through the journey with cancer, liver disease, or heart failure, we have regular check-ins to be able to say, "Are you still, if you still want us to treat aggressively, that's fine. We've got
Mm.
planned, we've got you scheduled for a hospitalization and a cath on Monday, but just checking, is that still what you want?" And I think if we get better as a profession in those sorts of check-ins,
Mm.
we can get it right more often. We did a study years ago at the University of Pennsylvania and found that about 1 in 8 people said they wouldn't want chemotherapy if it would extend their life by a year, which is not a surprising statistic, except Heen Liu, who's my project manager then, pointed out to me that we were doing these interviews where it's easy to get patients who don't have any distractions, which is in the chemotherapy suite. So every single one of those people who said they wouldn't want chemotherapy if it would extend their life for a year was getting chemotherapy.
Mm.
And so I become more and more convinced that there is, at any one point in time, a substantial minority of people who really don't want, or at least have serious questions about the treatment plan that medicine has created for them. And if we don't stop and talk with people early and often, we're going to miss that. So yes, we keep treating long past the point at which it's helpful, often long past the point at which patients really want it, or it would make sense to people. And it's really hard to convince my colleagues of that. Although I think the culture is changing gradually. I think it's more, I wouldn't say less aggressive, but I'd say the tone of medicine is a little bit more thoughtful and intentional, than it was 20 years ago when I started out. People really are starting to think more, and providers have a lot of moral distress when they see patients near the end of life in an ICU, on pressors, intubated, ventilated, and they're thinking, "Oh man, this is horrible. I don't really like what we're doing to this person." So those sorts of
Amazing.
experiences I think are helpful in recalibrating, but it's a slow march.
Yeah, and I can really feel that as well culturally, because I think there's such a language around that sort of we fight. There's almost like a real aggressive language to. I'm thinking particularly actually I had someone on the podcast last year, and he's got stage 4 cancer, so it's very much living with cancer and really focusing on quality of life and all of that. And we were talking about that language of fight, 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 and actually just how damaging that can be. Because that almost that I suppose for me, if I'm putting myself in just a patient's shoes, it does mean that you're sort of going in there to be like, right, I am going to fight aggression to the end. Where actually, what I really connect with in palliative care conversations is that person centered approach to say, okay, if we got you really comfortable and more comfortable than if we have this aggressive treatment, that means that then you can spend time with whether it's your kids, whether it's your grandkids, you can have more quality time, you can do more of the things that bring you joy, even if that's just eating bowls of ice cream and watching the
Mhm.
sunset. It really does engage us in different conversations. But also I think there's, for me, what I connect in with is there's an acknowledgement in those constant check-ins that I suppose there is a process for us to go through, particularly if end of life is something that we haven't contemplated and faced into our own mortality before. So I'd be really curious to know about that, and if there is a bit of a journey with some patients of almost a bit like your book is very much that journey of let's understand, let's go on this undiscovered journey of what dying and death is, so we can understand it more. Do you see that similarly in journeys with patients and their families, where actually it takes many conversations for people then perhaps to get more comfortable with the fact that actually this is a journey now where it's just about making me as comfortable as possible and giving me that best quality of life, and perhaps letting go of that fight and what we're sort of told to do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really strange journey in a way because, we're stranger now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
40 years ago, if you had cancer, maybe there were 1 or 2 chemotherapy drugs available. You would try those, and either they would work or they wouldn't, but that was it. And so, there was a much cleaner demarcation between aggressive treatment and hospice and comfort care, and you knew when you crossed that line. I think now cancer is a good example because but not the only one, because there are lots of treatments out there. There's first line, second line, third line, there's salvage chemotherapy, there's fourth line, there are immunotherapies, and then lots and lots of complementary and alternative therapies that have effectiveness that's questionable at best. But that transition is much harder to put on a map now because there's always something else. And even if there isn't another treatment available at the hospital where you're getting care, you can hear that Memorial Sloan Kettering or the University of Chicago or wherever has this new clinical trial for a new drug that you could try it. So there's always
Wow.
this fear of missing out almost
Yes.
medically. There's always something else. And so it often prolongs this process by which people are thinking about their goals, because there's always a way, or almost always a way, to say, well, I'm not quite ready to think about dying yet.
Mm.
Because there's this clinical trial up in New York. I'm going to go up there and see if I can get into it. And if that doesn't
Mhm.
work, then we can talk about end of life. But even if it doesn't work, then there's something else. So that can often gets kicked down the road, which is why often in palliative care, I'm always happy to talk to patients about how they want to live their final days, where they want to be, what's important to them. But that's a door that, in my experience, often doesn't open until pretty late. Yeah, and so often what we do is spend time talking with people, getting to know them, what's important to them, what their hopes and fears are, and then use that to populate a plan for end of life care, which it often happens more quickly than it should. Somebody who's been struggling with cancer for 5, 6 years, multiple relapses, multiple surgeries, like that day is coming. But it's really hard for anybody to talk about their end of life. The one exception, which we're trying to explore in some research here at Duke, I work with Kat Pollack, who's a social sciences researcher here. There's a tradition, especially in the Southeast United States, which I think is relatively unusual elsewhere, of pre-planning funerals.
Mhm.
So people sometimes
Yes.
5, 10 years in advance or more will plan their funerals, sit down with the funeral director. And so we started thinking, well, these are people who, for whatever reason, are starting to think about their death. Could we get them to think about other sources of planning, like hospice and whether they'd want to be resuscitated, where they'd like to die? To if they're focused on memorial service, could we expand that just a little bit to
Yes.
talk about end of life care? So we're actually partnering with funeral directors to engage in some of these advanced care planning conversations. But that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. I think it's really hard to sit down, look in a mirror, and say, "Yeah, I'm not going to be here in 6 months." That's a really tough conversation to have with yourself. So sometimes we kind of nibble around the edges, figure out what's important to people, and that way, when it does come time to have that conversation, we're ready and the patient's ready. But even then, it's tough.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it is, yeah, obviously all the fears and everything that comes up. I love that of getting upstream to those conversations that people are having with funeral directors. And I think there is, because obviously it's in our society, in our culture, the Western world in particular has just disconnected from death almost as a part of just natural being a human. And a big part of that, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but for me, it definitely feels like, I mean, my alma mater was living with my parents nearly to the end.
Yeah.
The very last stages, she went into a hospice. But actually, it feels like with everything going into hospitals, it gives us that choice to put everything a little bit at arm's length and not, I suppose, throughout our whole life stare into the face of what will come. And when I did my end of life doula training, we were all there because we wanted to study and we knew we had to look at ourselves. But I remember the sessions where it was very much around advanced care planning, and then also planning for after we died, what are our wishes for our funeral, etc. And we all came into that session absolutely terrified. They did a bit at the start about how are you feeling? Let's hold space for your fears. But equally, what was interesting was as soon as we pushed through that resistance and did it as a group, I think there's something in community, in having these conversations together, that changes it from I'm just going to sit here and write everything out on my own or find a website to fill in. It actually, I suppose the ice broke very, very quickly. And it interestingly felt quite empowering and almost quite relieving to just know, okay, in 1 hour, we've just gone and set that all out and it's all there. But yeah, what are your thoughts on where we've gone as a society and where we need to go culturally when it comes to dying and death, and us accepting it and leaning into it?
Yeah, that's kind of the $1 million question, which people have been asking, by the way, for hundreds of years, and we haven't made a lot of progress. So I doubt I'll be able to set us straight in the next 30 seconds. But it almost feels like there's a race going on. There's more and more treatment and more emphasis on palliative care and hospice and thinking about death. A good friend of mine, Joan Tino, who's retired now, but did a brilliant study with Pedro Gonzalo, and they basically turned this into a question. So this was probably 10 years ago or so. And they asked, all right, everybody's talking about hospice and palliative care, and everybody's talking about death and dying. How has that changed what end-of-life care looks like in the United States? Which is like one of these brilliant questions that Joan asks a lot. And I hear these questions, I think, man, I wish I'd thought of that. So they took a national sample in the United States and found that, yes, more people are using hospice. More people are accessing palliative care, but they do it later and later. And that space in between a diagnosis and hospice is increasingly filled with more hospitalizations, more time in the ICU, more transitions back and forth. And so what they found was that, yes, we're all thinking more about end-of-life care, death and dying. More people know about what hospice is, and more people are using it, but we're also using more stuff that medicine has to offer. And I think if you had asked me that question 15 or 20 years ago, I would have said, gradually as people understand hospice and palliative care more, start thinking about end-of-life care more, they'll start saying no to another round of chemotherapy. They'll start saying no thanks to time in the ICU. But that hasn't happened. We've got these two almost, they're not competing. Palliative care doesn't compete with treatment, but different pathways that, patients are traveling along at the same time. And sometimes it feels faster and faster, like more hospices are opening every day and there are more chemotherapy regimens every day, and it just gets more complex. So I think the way to bridge that, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. There's a economist named Herbert Simon, who's British, I think, probably the smartest person nobody's ever heard of, the only person I know of who won both the Turing Prize and the Nobel Prize. But he said that a lot of opportunities for innovation happens when there's just too much of something that you just can't quite get your head around. Whether it's too much garbage that needs to be disposed, or in this case, in healthcare, just too much information, too much stuff. And he said that was a signal that the time was right for innovation. And I think we've really over the last 5 or 10 years hit that point in medicine, that there's just way more. I mean, medicine, healthcare has become this really complicated system that nobody really understands. Like those of us who are healthcare providers should be able to navigate the system for family members, and it's just way too complex. So if I'm a department chair and I can't navigate the health system, that's a bad sign. So long way of saying, I've started to think about ways that we can help people, patients, families navigate the health system and navigate those choices. So at any one time, they can be thinking about hospice and palliative care, and they can also think about aggressive treatment. And there are ways that they could inhabit that space and think about that, talk with family members, talk with providers. And it gets back to the early part of the conversation about having these discussions early and often, because I think that's the only way we can try to bring those together, because the alternative is it's like traveling on, the Autobahn in Germany, going 200 kilometers an hour, and then all of a sudden coming to an abrupt stop. What we want is a more gradual glide path. So care is gradually ramped up near the end of life. Aggressive treatment is dialed back, and it's a more gradual transmission instead of what happens now. You have these two competing forces,
Mm.
and we could treat, and then all of a sudden stop. So I wish I
Wow.
had a better answer, but it's something that I think we all need to struggle with for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's an answer that acknowledges, as you say, obviously, I had no idea of that level of complexities of all the treatment. I mean, that what a menu, all the treatment options
Yeah.
and everything. And I love that as well, and just how that almost the path that could be plotted into some sort of a journey. It links so beautifully to obviously your book as that
Yeah.
doctor's travel guide to the end of life. So I'd love to hear from you as well around any of your advice for how patients and their supporters could advocate for and improve their end of life care. So if someone is, whether it's themselves directly journeying or someone who they love and they're journeying alongside them, what would your advice be?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, the most important way to advocate for end of life care is to advocate for care. Um, and I think so often we see family members converging around somebody in the last days of life and trying to get involved and trying to advocate. And I'm not being critical. We're all busy. None of us, I think, spend as much time with family members as we should, or as we would hope to. But to come in and advocate for end of life when you haven't been with that person and advocating for them to get a flu vaccine, for them to get a mammogram, for them to maybe stop taking that medication that's not really helping, and to understand what's important to them and what makes them tick. So I think one piece of advice would be to at least have some involvement, with that person's care
Oh,
throughout the illness journey, even if you're
yeah.
not the primary caregiver, because it's almost impossible to come in right at the end and advocate for a
Mm,
better end of life care, because it's not based on a foundation of knowing their goals and hopes and fears.
yeah.
And I think when we come in, kind of parachute in right near the end, we bring our own biases. I mean, we do that anyway, obviously,
Mm,
but I think it's easier to bring our own biases when you haven't talked to your grandmother in 2 months, and then you come in and have strong feelings about whether she should be hospitalized for pneumonia. So I think there's that, and I think in terms of other advocacy, it's most of the stuff you'd expect. It's a lot of what I find to be helpful for families is kind of practice conversations in a way. I mean, talking to somebody about what's important to them, asking questions, helping them to ask questions, and I think sometimes the conversations that I have with patients, the most effective and productive ones and meaningful ones are conversations that they've had in one way, shape, or form with a daughter, with a brother, with a cousin. And so they've sort of practiced saying things, and they've had these conversations and thought of questions they need to ask. And Dan Ariely, who's a colleague here at Duke, created an online platform called Epilogue that we've been doing some research with them, implementing Epilogue in Duke Health. And it's a fascinating platform that asks questions, but encourages people to ask questions too. And it's almost an AI powered chatbot in a way that has conversations with people,
wow.
to get them thinking, and you can engage family members as well. Not meant to replace conversations with healthcare providers, but
Mhm.
kind of a practice. Like, have these conversations, you try out some language, you try out some answers, see if that works. Um, Kat Pollock, who I mentioned before, and I have
Yeah.
a grant out that hopefully will get funded for a goals of care chatbot that is telephonic. People can call in, have a conversation with the chatbot, who's called Frank, just good name. And it's a way for them to practice having these conversations, and then to signal if they want to have a conversation with a healthcare provider, and then they
Wow.
could share that information with the provider. Again, not trying to eliminate the provider from these conversations, but most of the thinking and planning and intentionality for decisions is not going to happen in a clinic office room
Really?
or in a hospital room with a provider. It's going to happen with friends and family members and, walks in the park with your dog. And so the more we can capture those sorts of thoughts and goals and preferences and hopes and fears, and then communicate them with the healthcare team. That's one thing we're really, really trying to do. But if I had advice for family members, it would be to be that sounding board, to be there, to have those sorts of conversations, ask questions, help patients come up with questions they want to ask.
That really resonates with me. I had the gift actually with my grandparents of it's. I was, I had a dream, and my nan came to me in the
Mm,
dream and said, "We're nearly ready to go." And I know it was my subconscious saying, "You haven't seen your grandparents in quite a while," which was in truth avoidance, because it was very hard to see them in their dementia journey. And this was
yeah.
3 years ago, and that actually sent me on my journey of getting interested in the dying process, learning about it, learning about grief on the other side and everything. And that was actually just after I definitely put my hands up as someone who at the time before, just before that, I was working in Formula One, traveling the world with the
Huh.
motorsport and
I
doing a
should
lot
know
of
that.
races and stuff. It was very, very busy, very fast paced. And I always used to put my family to the bottom of the list, and particularly seeing my grandparents, which was in part life of busyness, but also it was where are my priorities, and also the avoidance. I could hide behind my busyness to avoid actually spending time with them, because it hurt me deeply that every time I saw them, which was
Mhm.
in truth at times about every 6 months, I'd pop in and see them. And that was actually the greatest gift. So I just left Formula One, starting my own business. I had the time and the space. And after that dream, I sprinted up to their care home the next day thinking, oh my goodness, one of them's going to go. And I got the gift of spending my granddad's final year every single Friday, going and sitting with him and my nan for an afternoon and just witnessing the process. And actually, there's something really powerful. Obviously, I wasn't there earlier to understand and to advocate for him, but just being there to witness, and even in that, in his care home, being able to advocate for him there on that one day a week when I was there, I learned so much that then equipped me for his final few weeks and then final few days, that I can really, really resonate and reflect upon me, and then people who are consistent versus those who, yeah, did sort of obviously understandably rush to be there at the end. And it is a very, very different experience. And I think as well for me, what it allowed me to do was to face into my fears before it got to that point where he was on the morphine pump, and it was really quite distressing to watch. I'd been on such a journey with him that I could also really understand there's a real, what really comes through from as I've read your book is I'm connecting into the fact that our body knows there's a wisdom in our body.
Mhm.
So what I found is
Yeah.
actually witnessing my granddad on a weekly basis and my nan enabled me to just connect into an inner wisdom that was just when it was time for him to go into the active stages of dying, it felt like the most natural thing in the world to me. It just didn't
Mhm.
didn't feel distressing as it was for other family members who were around. So yeah, I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I see that all the time. I think
Wow.
family members parachuting near the end, there's sort of a fight or flight,
Yes.
really a high adrenaline moment, which
Yes.
is, speaking for myself, is not the best time that I find to make decisions, or at least good decisions.
True.
But the sort of thoughtful and intentional relationship building, because you can't really advocate for somebody unless you know them,
Yes.
and you know what they were like yesterday, and after having spent some time with somebody sitting by the bedside, that when they grimace like that, that probably doesn't
Oh,
mean they're in pain. It means they're thirsty and they'd like some ice chips. But you don't know that if you haven't spent a lot of time with them. Just one thing I wanted to go back to quickly, if I could. You mentioned a dream, and that's one element that I've of end of life care that I've gotten really fascinated by. A variant of that, which is how often people seem to know that they're going to die. And you could say that's kind of trivial. Like if somebody is in a hospice unit, of course they know that they're going to die, but we still hear these statements, like "I'm ready" or "I'm going home," as you heard in the dream. And, the skeptical researcher in me says, well, maybe people say that all the time, and we just remember it when that utterance is followed a few minutes or an hour later by death. And it's just our availability bias that leads us to create relationships where none exist. But so that's the cynical part of me. But I've seen it so many times.
wow.
I told the story in the book of a man I took care of when I was working in Botswana once, who had AIDS, had really advanced illness, but was not, I thought, imminently dying. But all of a sudden, really said he wanted to go home. He needed to get home, and it was so forceful that we couldn't really say no. He wasn't done with his treatment, but we thought, all right, we could give him oral medications, and he's going to leave. So we hired a taxi for him that brought him back to his village, and then he died later on the same day. And I'm still surprised. I wasn't a superb diagnostician back then, not that I am now, but I would have thought that if he were really imminently dying, I would have noticed something, but I didn't. But he seemed to know. And there's so many stories like that. Talk to any hospice nurse who's been in the field for a while, and he or she will tell you all sorts of stories. And I don't know how that works, but I think it's real, and it's something that I've learned as a clinician to take seriously. If somebody says, "I think I'm ready," or "I'm going home," sometimes what they mean is exactly that they're leaving the hospital and, and they're going home. So it doesn't pay to read too much metaphorically into that, but more often than not, in my experience, that's a prognostic sign that we should take seriously, even though I don't know how it works.
Yeah, I actually experienced that with my granddad. I remember him saying to me, "Yeah, I'm ready to go now. I'm ready to go home." And I said to him, I said, "Do you mean you're home in Pangbourne?" And described their house to him that they hadn't lived in for a number of years. He said, "No, not there." And
Yeah.
that was, I think, about a month before he died. And I thought, oh wow. I remember telling my mum, and she was like, "Okay, we all need to make sure that we go and see him." So I think it's really, I think there's something in that, the wisdom within, and also if we listen to it, and if we're open to hear that and to say, I remember reading, I forget if it was Dr. Catherine Mannix or someone, and I remember seeing her on a podcast or something, and she said something along the lines of, yeah, if you see any of these signs, and if everybody rushes to the person's bedside, but then they live for another 6 months plus or whatever it is, then it's just a bonus. You've got a bonus trip.
Yeah, exactly.
No one's going to be upset about that. So really beautiful. And I think as well, one thing is that I also really related to in your book was when you mentioned around how the final breath, how it's quite unremarkable oftentimes. And that's something where with each of my grandparents, I was almost waiting. That's the thing, you're waiting, you're watching. I think you talk about this in your book. The family are just there, like it's going to be some big Hollywood Netflix moment. And actually for all three of them, I didn't end up being there when they died. And I believe that my grandparents were very protective of me. So I also have a feeling that they chose the day that I chose to go home and have a sleep and have a shower to die. But I think as well, there's something for me in until they die as well, just really listening hard, and whether it's for signs like that, but also for when I read your book, it reframed those final days of actually we weren't waiting for that final breath. We were enjoying their final hours, minutes of life, and the beauty that they held in all of those.
And I think that's one of the reasons why hospice is so attractive to so many people, because there aren't all of the cues that can be distracting.
Yes.
Like when somebody dies in an intensive care unit, there's the breaths, there's that insistent cardiac monitor that's right over the bed. You can't really, you can't avoid. There are the beeps. And obviously when people are dying, we try to turn those off. We disconnect wires. But up until that point, it's really actually hard to pay attention to somebody. It's like if you're, in somebody's house and you're trying to have a conversation and there's this huge widescreen TV 5 feet away that's cranked up really loud. You can't really pay attention to the person in front of you because this technology is overwhelming our consciousness. And it's so seductive to, like, I've been in plenty of family meetings where we're talking about a patient who's dying, and everybody's focused on the little blips and squiggles on the cardiac monitor when they should be talking and thinking. And again, not being critical. It's not being critical of them, but it's really hard. I've been in family meetings where I've just unhooked the wires and shut off the monitor and said, all right, like, that's not what's important right now.
Wow. Oh, I think all of this is so important to have these conversations because it can help us to reframe those moments, and what we pay attention to, or that hospice could be a nicer choice. Now, I have one final question for you, David, before we complete on our conversation, and that is if you could leave our listeners with just one truth about the dying process, about death, that might make it seem a little bit less scary, what would that be?
Yeah, this is maybe not gonna come across as being as convincing as I'd hoped, but, dying really isn't all that bad,
Mhm.
and, I've seen a lot of people die in my years,
Yeah.
uh, hundreds definitely, probably thousands. Um, a statistic that if my malpractice insurer didn't know that I was a palliative care doc would make them really, really uneasy. But I've certainly seen a lot of deaths, and
Yeah.
with some very rare exceptions, the body does take care of us, and a lot of symptoms of nausea, pain, hunger, the body manages to tamp down. We can make a lot of progress, if not eliminating, then sharply reducing those other symptoms. And in the last few hours, many people are not conscious. They slip into a sleep and then pass away. It's not true of everybody, but in general, it's not the worst journey in the world, in terms of travel metaphors. Um, and I think, you know, if I could offer some advice, that may carry some weight coming from me, but it'll carry more weight to people who have a chance to witness deaths themselves. So being able to have a chance to do that, with family members and to pay attention, I think the more you have a chance to see and experience the deaths of others firsthand, secondhand, then I think the less anxiety we'll have when it's our turn.
Oh, that's such powerful advice. Thank you so much, David, because for me, I really relate to that. I'd say for anyone tuning in who hasn't witnessed a death, and as and when that comes, which we will all obviously face into it, to definitely go there. For me, as soon as I pushed through my immediate resistance, it was such a fulfilling and love filled and obviously very sad as well journey, but actually it wasn't as scary and it wasn't as terrifying and all of the stuff that we think it's going to be. So I think that's really, really wise words. And finally, we've got to give just a minute or however long you want to talk about your book, Undiscovered Country, A Doctor's Travel Guide to the End of Life. I've loved it. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about it and obviously anything that you wish to about yourself before we complete.
Sure, thanks. We're at the end of the hour. I'll be brief, but I really wrote this because I got so many questions, have gotten so many questions over the years from patients and families about, well, what's the end going to be like? And I wanted something I could hand to them. And so this is sort of the product of a lot of thinking and learning and trying a lot of conversations with patients and families, figuring out what worked. And then trying to put some science behind it, science and stories. I can give you all the evidence I can dream up about what dying is like, but stories also have a lot of weight. Um, so I tried to think about end of life care as a trip, as an adventure, because arguably it is, but also I think putting that frame around it at least opens the possibility that it actually might not be that bad, and there actually might be opportunities for new insights and consciousness and new experiences. I know it seems a little bit far fetched, but people have made far less exciting trips out of more, or vice versa. So I think there's a lot of potential in that space right near the end of life to grow and learn and make connections. But it really has to start and end with the thesis that dying is not as uncomfortable or as painful as many people think. It's not that bad, and modern medicine, palliative care, and hospice in particular, can make it quite comfortable, and it's not something to be scared of.
I can really, having read your book, there is a real gentleness whilst also being so thorough and a really beautiful walkthrough of all the science. I have so enjoyed it. I said to you before we started our conversation, David, that the two people I spoke to before our chat today have recommended it to them. It's
Nice.
absolutely brilliant. And it's definitely a book that our world needs. So definitely recommend everybody to go out and get their hands on it. And David, just from the bottom of my heart, for our conversation today, for your book, and for everything that you do in the world. Just thank you so much. And thank you for joining me today on Death on the Daily.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thanks for all that you do too. I take care of one patient at a time. You reach hundreds, thousands, millions, so
Oh,
thank you for that.
oh, thank you, David. Thank you for joining me on Death on the Daily. If you liked this episode, it would mean a lot if you could hit subscribe. Plus, head to the show notes to find out about my work as a grief coach, and there's a grief journaling freebie there for you. Until we meet here next time, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something